It was a warm summer day in the middle of June. Filmmaker Shen Kaige had just returned to his motherland China after a successful trip to Cannes, where his most recent film had just won the biggest accolade a film could obtain, the Palme d'Or. As soon as he began stepping down from the plane, dozens of journalists were waiting to get some words from Mr. Chen and capture some footage and pictures of his big accomplishment. For anyone else, this would have felt like a moment full of joy and pride, a victorious chapter that could make anyone else feel like they were on top of the world. However, for Mr. Chen, this was a painful moment because he knew those pictures and shots of him wouldn't see the light of day as his big epic was banned in his home country. This is a complicated story of one of China's best films. The themes and topics it embraces, the voices it echoes, and the tragedy of the parallels between its main character and its real-life actor. This is a story of Shen Kaige's Farewell, My Concubine. Farewell, My Concubine is a film that was on my to-watch list ever since I did my undergrad in China. I remember the student body was showing it in the university's auditorium as part of a queer film series that was part of a yearly event called Ally Week.
And this is my best friend, Valentina. She's an ally. Talk, Valentina.
Ally.
I didn't go in at the time, but it definitely raised my interest, given that I was aware that the LGBTQ plus community was not very accepted in the country or by the government. So it was extremely surprising for me to see that there's this Chinese film with a queer character as a lead that portrays some gay and transgender subtext. It wasn't until some years later that I finally watched it, and I was in awe. Not only because of the queer aspects of the film, but also its political depictions of some very sensitive moments in the country's history, and the way all of this is intertwined to create a subversive epic that I had not yet experienced before. I'm not joking when I say that this film, the mere fact of its existence, feels like a miracle in itself, given the time and place of its conception. But the more I researched about it, the sadder I felt about how unfairly this masterpiece was treated, not only by China, but also by some critics and foreign studio executives. So I'm doing this essay to give it the justice it deserves, for all of those who contributed to the creation of this piece. I'm creating this video to tell you what makes this film so good, to help you understand more the place it comes from, and also provide some historical and cultural context that I feel can honestly help you understand it better, given that I believe that without it, the story can get a little confusing and hard to follow. So bring your coffee or tea, grab some snacks, and let's get started. Quick disclaimer, there will be spoilers in this video, starting with a quick summary of the plot to refresh the memory of those who have seen the film already. And if you haven't, I highly recommend you watch it first and then come back here. Don't worry, this video will still be here, I promise. The film follows a relationship of two friends and Chinese opera singers throughout the decades, starting from the first years of the Republic after the fall of the Qing dynasty to the end of the Cultural Revolution. Dao Zi, a boy with delicate features, is abandoned by his prostitute mother in a Peking opera troupe where he befriends Shi Tou, an older and heroic boy. In the troupe, they are trained for different roles, Dao Zi focusing on Dan or female roles, and Shi Tou training for Sheng or male roles. After years of torturous training and unfortunate events that forged their friendship, Dao Zi and Shi Tou become Peking opera stars by the time Japan begins to invade China, becoming known by their artistic names Sheng Die and Duan Xiaolou, respectively. By this time, Yi has developed some sort of romantic feelings for Xiaolo, who doesn't exactly reciprocate them, as Xiaolo becomes involved and marries a prostitute called Ju Xian. Yi becomes involved with Master Yuan, a wealthy theater patron. This relationship is very nuanced, and we will talk more about it later, but think about it as a semi-intimate friendship with some transactional benefits. Now, going back to Xiaolo and Ju Xian, Yi doesn't seem to accept Ju Xian. And throughout the film, we see efforts from both Ju Xian and Yi to keep Xiaolo away from the other. Yi is fearful that Xiaolo might leave Peking opera behind now that he's married, and Ju Xian attempts to get him to do exactly that as a means to get Xiaolo away from Yi. We see several performances of Farewell My Concubine, each of them set against the backdrop of a different power reigning the country and the relationship of such power with Peking opera. Even through all of these changes, our three protagonists managed to survive instances where they had gotten in trouble with the authorities. That is, until the Cultural Revolution arrives and creates havoc within China. The two friends then become betrayed by their quasi-adopted son, Xiao Si, a boy they had found as a baby when they were kids and brought into the opera troupe. Xiao Si reports them to the Red Guards, accusing them of crimes against the communist ideology. Along with other Peking opera actors, Yi and Xiaolo are being humiliated in front of the entire village, with Ju Xian observing in the sidelines. As pressure increases and the leader of the Red Guards demands that Xiaolo reveals Yi's crimes, Xiaolo breaks and accuses Yi of prostituting himself to Master Yuan and performing for the Japanese. Yi, feeling betrayed, also begins to accuse Ju Xian of prostitution and Xiaolo of being with her. Then Xiaolo declares that he doesn't love her as a method of self-protection, ending with all of them betraying each other. After the devastating betrayal, Ju Xian hangs herself. Years later, in 1977, right after the end of the Cultural Revolution, we see the two friends in their Peking opera costumes, acting Farewell My Concubine for a last time, except this time, Yi does end by committing suicide in real life. Farewell My Concubine was an adaptation of the equally titled novel by Hong Kong novelist Lillian Lee. Beijing director Shen Kai-ge was first introduced to a novel by Taiwanese actor and producer Xu Feng. At the 1988 Cannes Film Festival, Feng gave Kai-ge the novel. At first, Kai-ge didn't think much about it, as he would put it in his own words. "I thought the novel was a bit thin. Lillian didn't have a great grasp of the situation in China or the world of the Peking opera. She didn't have any real emotional understanding of the Cultural Revolution either. She didn't live through it. Her language was another problem. You could tell right off that she wasn't a Beijing person." This was very important for Kai-ge. Due to the different cultures developed between mainland China and Hong Kong, it was very easy to identify when a novel that had as a backdrop the Cultural Revolution was written by someone who did not understand the depth of the historical event. In addition, he believes that the relationship between the characters wasn't well established and didn't go as deep as to move him. However, in a work trip to Hong Kong in 1990, Kai-ge had the opportunity to talk and discuss the novel with Lillian Lee. It was in this meeting that Kai-ge understood the author's cleverness and the novel's potential, so they agreed to bring a mainland screenwriter, Lu Wei, on board, and on January 1991, a first draft was finished. Now, something very interesting about Chinese film productions of that time was the flourishing of Pan-Asian co-production between mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. To give more context, by the late 1980s, political changes were occurring. Around this time, the only market that was succeeding in the film production was Hong Kong, adopting a more mainstream cinema. This success provided Hong Kong with the film marketing experience and was dominating the Taiwanese and Chinese box offices. By late 1980s, Taiwan's film industry was struggling, and in 1987, Taiwan lifted the martial art. giving citizens more liberties, as well as the reintroduction of a foreign exchange market. This is when Taiwanese production companies recognized the opportunity to produce films utilizing mainland China resources and Hong Kong marketing expertise. The mainland was very attractive for Taiwanese and Hong Kong filmmakers. Due to the size of the territory, the mainland had a vast diversity of landscapes and a great pool of talent for filmmaking, not to mention the big profits that could be earned if films were released there. However, due to Taiwanese restrictions on the showing of films that were mainly shot in the mainland, Hong Kong also worked as a middleman to loophole the restrictions. This is when the Taiwanese Finance and Hong Kong Produced Businesses Alliance was created, bringing to life production companies like Hong Tai and Thompson Films, the latter created by Su Feng. Yes, the one that gave the novel to Kaige. So another interesting twist of the time was Chinese producers discovering that our films that won awards and did well abroad would awaken domestic market interest and get seats at the theater filled. This first happened after City of Sadness won the first prize at the Venice Film Festival back in 1988. And thanks to this achievement, more art films were produced such as Raise a Red Lantern, Story of Chu Ju, To Live, The Puppet Master, and of course, Farewell My Concubine. Now great! We have the director, we have the script, the money, the location, but what about the talent? The intention to cater both domestic and international audiences deeply influenced the casting choices. Actor Zhang Fengyi was cast to portray Duan Xiaolou. He was one of the mainland's most popular actors and had once been part of an opera troupe, so his experience was a good addition. Casting the role of Ju Xian was relatively easy as well. As a leading lady in many internationally acclaimed films, like Raise a Red Lantern and Story of Chu Ju, actress Gong Li was cast as Ju Xian to attract international critics and audiences. And for Shen Jianyi, the casting was not as simple. Similar to the role of Ju Xian, Kaige was primarily interested in getting a person with star power for the role of Die. Leslie Cheung was a big star with a great musical career during the 80s in Hong Kong. At the time of the film pre-production, he was living in Canada and retired when he was approached with the role. Looking for a new career, when he first heard about the role of Die, he fell in love and felt like he was Die. Simultaneously, actor John Lone was also offered the part. John had recently appeared in the internationally acclaimed film The Last Emperor, giving him international appeal. He coincidentally had prior Peking opera training, so when news came out of the fight for the role, Leslie backed down as he did not have the same star power or training as John. Not to mention, Leslie spoke Cantonese, not Mandarin, as many Hong Kong natives. As the contract was settled between Kaige and Lone, rumors about John abandoning the project due to creative differences arose. It was then that Leslie was finally given the part. This was the best thing that could have happened to the film, as many would agree that Leslie was the soul of Farewell. So I'm gonna try to give an oversimplified overview of modern Chinese history, but it covers most of the 20th century, so bear with me. Believe me, it took me a bit to completely understand this, so if you still get a little confused, I'll link some good resources that help me better understand. Politics, am I right? So at the beginning of the 20th century, China was still a kingdom ruled by emperors. It wasn't until 1912 that this would end with the Qing dynasty being overthrown by revolutionaries that would later form the Nationalist Party and the creation of the Republic of China. Now, a couple of years later, in 1921 to be exact, the Communist Party was created. Okay, this is different. We have the Nationalist and the Communist. You got me? Awesome. The Nationalists were not doing a great job at creating a unified country, so at first they had some help from the Communists. But this, of course, quickly created tensions. Then came Japan looking for more land because Japan was greedy and started invading China in 1931. But in 1937 is when the Second Sino-Japanese War officially began and Japan invades most of northeastern China, including Beijing. By 1945, the end of World War II is when Japan retracts, and the nationalists were in power of China again. However, it wouldn't take long for a civil war to begin. Communists and nationalists fight with each other once again, ending with the communists winning. That is when in 1949, the People's Republic of China was born, aka Communist China, led by the one and only Daddy Mao. But it didn't end there. The following years were full of hardships. Daddy Mao thought if most of the population industrialized, then the economy would grow. But this meant not enough people in the rural areas producing enough food for the rest of the population. So there was famine, ending with millions of citizens dying. Scared that the communist morale was lowering, Daddy looked towards the most impressionable people, aka teenagers, and inspired them to boost the communist ideology, or more specifically, the philosophy of Maoism. This began the Cultural Revolution in 1966. So the following 10 years would also be filled with terror and paranoia. Teenagers took this Maoist ideology to an extreme. Gangs of teenagers formed the Red Guards, who would attack and purge citizens that would not seem to follow the Maoist ideology or seem to venerate the four olds. Old ideas, old costumes, old culture, and old habits. As Tony Chamas from One Dime compares it, imagine if a bunch of Gen Z suddenly start canceling not only celebrities, but also all their parents, teachers, neighbors, you, or anybody that maybe said a bad joke or might hold a grudge against them. But instead of just leaving a bunch of mean comments on your Insta and talking shit behind your back, they humiliate you in front of dozens of people, send you to re-education camp where you will most probably die because you don't have that much to eat, you're working long hours, and that rat looks kinda yummy, but it might be poisoned. But you get the gist of it, right? It wasn't only teenagers at the end, but everybody was betraying everybody. Some as a way to get payback for some petty grudge or jealousy, others as a means of self-protection. We all know that the best way to protect yourself from being accused of something is by accusing somebody else of their faults as a way to elevate your moral ethics for everyone else to see. So the Cultural Revolution was filled with hysteria, and although it wasn't Mao's intention, what the Red Guards and the population were doing became bigger than him and got out of hand. It wasn't until 1976, when Mao died, that the Cultural Revolution came to an end and Mao's inner circle, the Gang of Four, was punished for the chaos that China had gone through. After all this, the country slowly began to recover, and regardless of the tragedies caused by Communist China under the rule of Mao, China is still communist to this day. Duh. There is of course more that happened in Chinese history, like the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989, which I believe is maybe another reason why Kaige might have reconsidered during the project of farewell. The Tiananmen Square protest was another movement that opened Kaige's eyes to the concept of forces bigger than oneself that mold your identity without having a choice. However, I just wanted to leave it at that and cover the period that is shown in Farewell My Concubine. Although Shen Kaige accepted directing a film that is partly set in a very tumultuous times in the history of China, he always insisted that his intention was never to make some statement about the government or to create political discussions.
Of course, you can see this film as some political elements, but I never ever want to make a judgment, politically on Chinese politics or history.
After all, he did want this film to be a commercial hit both domestically and internationally. However, some didn't take it that way. I began this video by mentioning that Farewell My Concubine had won the Palme d'Or in 1993. Not just that, the film had done stupendously in award season and was well received by critics, earning also a Golden Globe, a BAFTA, a nomination at the Academy Awards, and the list goes on. But it would take years for Kaige's cut, the same version that had been screened at the Cannes Film Festival, to be available to the general public. This was due to the film falling into hands of artistically corrupt studio management on the international market side, and the banning later turned into censoring of the film on the domestic market side. If you were not aware, China has very strict censorship laws, meaning that all published, produced, and distributed media goes through a screening. And for films, this is done by the State Administration of Radio and Television. Now, there are certain topics or keywords that the ministry looks for in the screenings, such as anarchism, independence movements, democracy, certain religious movements, Tiananmen Square, Winnie the Pooh. Sorry, I had to do that one. And one of the biggest topics of censorship is anything related to Maoism and the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution is a very hard period for China to look back at. For the citizens, there are very deep scars and traumas that this movement and its leader caused. And for the Communist Party, it is a dangerous topic to let the media talk about due to the party's contribution to it. Due to how damaging to the party any portrayals of the movement could be, it's just easier to avoid and ban most media that depicts it. It doesn't matter if Kaiga's intention wasn't to criticize the government or to portray the Cultural Revolution as accurately as possible, given that he lived through it himself. What mattered to the party is that some scenes portraying the tragedies of the revolution were shown in the film, and that wouldn't pass for the ministry. Another scene that was not okay with the ministry was the ending. The last scene where we understand that Dai commits suicide. Suicide is another sensitive topic for China and its censorship laws. The biggest issue with the portrayal of Dai's suicide was that the scene was set in 1977, meaning after the Cultural Revolution had ended and the current Communist Party was already in power. For the ministry, this was a sort of message about discontent even with the current government. So this was also a red flag for the ministry. The same thing happened in Taiwan, as the nationalists were not happy either with their portrayal. Last but not least, China also has censorship on portrayals of LGBTQ+ relationships. Although there weren't physical relations or Dai's sexual preferences or identity weren't openly admitted in the film or press, the subtext was also enough for censors to decide that Farewell My Concubine could simply not be shown in the mainland. It did get to have a premiere in Shanghai due to the fear from the government of the outcry the public could have, as tickets had already been sold, but soon after the premiere, it was quickly removed from theaters. It wouldn't be till months later that the Chinese government would reconsider re-releasing the film again, with 14 minutes from the original version missing, as a way to seek international support for China's candidature to host the 2000 Olympic Games, which they ended up losing to Australia. At that point, the rest of the world was not having a positive view of China given the headlines of the films banned by the Chinese government. I have to say, while I was doing my research for this video, I found that a lot of newspaper articles and interviews with Kaiga at the time would shift the point of the movie towards the fact that the film was banned in its home country.
But Farewell My Concubine's international success did not immediately follow it back to China, where it was banned not once but twice. It was eventually released in China, but only after the most senior members of the Chinese Communist government demanded cuts. We welcome him now to talk about this controversial film and his experiences in China.
And although there were several reasons for the film being banned, the Western media would focus so much more on the fact that it was banned due to how the film portrays the Cultural Revolution. And more than helping out, I believe the press was hurting the film's purpose. This huge focus on the historical reasons for the ban sort of distorted what was the main point of the film, what Kaiga intended to say with the story. In many interviews, I would notice Kaiga's preoccupation and frustration with what the audience would take away from Farewell My Concubine, continuously reinstating that, in my film, society and politics occupy a secondary role. The blurred distinction between life and stage and the confusion of identity is the most important. But on the international distribution side of the film, things were not much different. If you have some knowledge of film distributors and how they work or the key figures in the business, you might have an idea of what occurred. When a film is produced, the next step is to sell the rights to a distributor, which is the entity that decides where to show the film and which territories. It might also handle marketing and all that jazz. One of the biggest distribution companies in 1990 was Miramax, and within Miramax, there was Harvey Weinstein. In addition to all the hideous acts Weinstein did, he was also notorious in the industry for doing terrible cuts to the films Miramax distributed. He did it so badly that it was another reason why Hayao Miyazaki hates America. So, Miramax bought the distribution rights to Farewell My Concubine and Weinstein also cut 14 minutes out of the film. So a new version missing some essential scenes was the one released and screened to the international audience, taking away the splendor of the original version that had been so critically acclaimed. It wouldn't be till Miramax released a DVD a couple of years later that a full version of the film could be watched by the public, but that might be too little too late. Also, I really hate the cover of this DVD. Just like Miramax cut, this cover is a little misleading. As a filmmaker, yeah, it's great that the film got so many awards, but what's the point if the general public cannot see what you ultimately wanted to say with your film? I think all the censoring and cuts contributed to the film not being remembered as the big masterpiece it is and being forgotten by the public. But going back to Kaiga's statement of politics being secondary in the story, let's take a closer look at what is at center stage in Farewell. If you remember when I explained the modern history of China, I said I only wanted to talk about the time period the film touches from 1924 to 1977. So if we go back to the timeline and only consider the various powers that ruled Beijing, which is where the movie is set, there were a total of 6 changes in powers in the span of 4 decades. The story doesn't introduce all these historical events as a way to evaluate politics. As a matter of fact, as viewers, we never feel completely involved with what's happening to the country or its citizens till the end. We are concerned with the love triangle our protagonists are battling. Instead, these historical events and ever-changing power dynamics are the story's backdrop and used as a foil to explore the continuum between identity and performance. Right off the bat, we can see the struggles of national identity as political parties and powers battle for full authority in China. But how does this impact our characters? As Helen Leong points out in her book Farewell, My Concubine, a queer film classic, the film utilizes costume changes as an analogy to trying to make oneself blend with society and the constantly changing political climate. Leong writes, Xia Lu's cavalier believed that adapting to changing political climate simply requires the same degree of sartorial dexterity will later prove not to be entirely accurate. The photographers praised the 2 actors for looking handsome in whatever fashion are assigned to them. This statement, like Xia Lu's assumption that political adaptation is akin to costume changes, fails to foresee the inability of anybody to truly adapt to the demands of the Cultural Revolution. Using the analogy of a mere change of clothes to make it look like a reflection of intrinsic beliefs to match the ones of extrinsic forces translates to characters like Xia Lu putting on a facade of something different than who he truly is to protect himself. If you spend years wearing Manchu-style robes, but suddenly one day you decide to wear a Chinese army uniform and hold a little red book to try to blend in, does that truly mean you believe in Mao's philosophy? Well, the film shows us with Xia Lu and other characters that our identity and beliefs don't work that way. The most that characters can do is put on a performance to camouflage to whatever political climate they are living under. Jerome Solberg and Paul Clark characterize the film as a national allegory, where the motif of performance contains more layers and complexity. As Clark points out, but Duan Xiaolu, Juxian, and all the people in the film must also perform in another sense, displaying their loyalty to the current power holders, be they the opera school principal, the brothel madame, Japanese generals, or Communist Party propaganda workers. The film also utilizes theater as a more literal study of performance and identity. We can observe that Xia Lu has a complete separation between who he is in real life and the characters he portrays on stage. For him, picking opera is a job. He might have respect for the art and use the costumes of emperor and fighters, but he never tries to be like Emperor Yu. The only point in the film where we might see Xia Lu trying to resemble the characters he plays is when he was a kid, striving to be heroic for Dao Zi. It is very clear from what the film shows us that Duan Xiaolu has an ease in setting boundaries between identity and performance, even camouflaging when the situation requires it. On the other side of the coin, Die constantly has trouble adapting and understanding where performance ends and reality begins.
5个软儿，那还不是我的霸王你的虞姬啊！
虞姬为什么要死？
蝶衣啊， 你可真是不疯魔不成活呀！可那是戏。
At a young age, Ye or Daozi had a tough time saying the line, "I am by nature a girl, not a boy," and would continue to say it the other way around. Not because it was a complicated line to memorize, but because we can see it is a state of denial. For Daozi, it wasn't as simple as repeating words and performing. Saying that line was a sort of declaration of a statement he didn't exactly believe or identify with at the time. After many years of torturous training and punishments by Master Guan, and a life-marking betrayal by his theater brother, Daozi finally says the line correctly and embraces his roles, specifically Concubine Yu, as part of his identity and strives to be Concubine Yu till his last breath.
我本是女娇娥，又不是小尼姑，年方28，正青春被师傅削去了头发。我本是女娇娥，又不是男儿郎。
Ye's inability to separate identity and performance translate to Ye being unable to perform to obtain what he wanted from others, to manipulate, you could say. So we have a character that, although he might tend to be self-centered and has gone through many events of being hurt and betrayed by others, his inability to perform for others results in him always being genuine to his feelings and values. As Leung says, to detach his body from his stage costume and persona, or to comply with the political demand of costume change, as Na Qin, Xiaolo, and many others do for survival during the Cultural Revolution, would mean for Ye an abandonment of self that he is unwilling or unable to attempt. We could do a comparison of Ye and Ju Xian, who serves as another foil character to the opera singer. Ju Xian is a very smart and skilled woman who knows how to resort to manipulation to obtain what she wants, like marrying Xiaolo, convincing Ye to rescue Xiaolo, or making Xiaolo separate himself from the opera. Again, she performs to make others do as she pleases, while Ye's brash earnestness might sometimes push others away. But most importantly, another way Ju Xian serves as a foil, as Kaiga mentions, is by her being a real woman versus Ye being a performative one. Ju Xian constantly is a reminder of what Ye cannot obtain or be, due to him not being physically a woman. The jealousy Ye experiences after Ju Xian's appearance creates a dissonance between the place he wants to hold in Xiaolo's life and who he is. It is cathartic for Ye to realize this discrepancy, that performance and reality are not the same thing, and that he struggles with his own identity, specifically with his gender identity. We will dig deeper into this side of Ye later in the video. I think one of the things that I love about Ye is that even though he wasn't the perfect friend or tutor, and he might act a little bit like a diva, he never allowed any forces or political climates to change him. He always strived to be Concubine Yu, and Concubine Yu, being a symbol of the virtue of loyalty, made Ye's biggest attribute to be loyal. Loyal to Peking opera and to Xiaolo, even in the most political heated moments. Unfortunately, this is highly contrasted with another recurrent theme in the story: betrayal. Ever since the creation of the novel, the story of Farewell carries heavy themes of loyalty and betrayal. The film doesn't even reach the 10-minute mark, and it already shows us the first act of betrayal. A mother covering her child's eyes, chopping the extra finger he has, and soon after abandoning him in the torturous opera troupe, never to see him again. Ye is certainly not the only one who lives the tragedies of betrayal, but he does become the one the film shows us suffering most of them. We see Chateau hurting Daozi with the smoking pipe after all that time of him being Daozi's protector. Then that time the troops master allowed Daozi's rape. There is also that time when Yu Xian manipulates Ye into singing for the Japanese to get Xiaolo liberated, something that would cost him later on. And the very significant scene where Xiao Su, the baby that Ye and Xiaolo had found and adopted as kids, steals Ye's Concubine Yu role and later reports both Xiaolo and Ye to the Red Guards. This scene was very close to home to the director, as he had regrets about reporting his own father to the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. We see betrayal on a personal level at first, escalating to a national level by the end. The biggest portrayal of betrayal was in the film's climax scene, where all three of our main characters accuse each other of crimes that have committed in front of all the Red Guards and citizens, either because of self-protection or as a broken-hearted reaction to being betrayed by a loved one. This theme shows Shen Kaige being part of China's fifth generation of filmmakers. For a bit of context, the fifth generation are those who attended the Beijing Film Academy after reopening for the first time after the Cultural Revolution, meaning that most of them lived through the hardships of the political movement firsthand and created films based on their experiences and memories from that period of political unrest. I think that the way the film portrays the shift of power mixed with betrayal gives a sense of how at the time everybody felt like playing a game of musical chairs, never knowing who might kick you off. From my interpretation, I also read the Cultural Revolution as a depiction of how one's own country can also betray its citizens with reforms and laws that might end up hurting those who were supposed to be benefited by. But something else that comes as a side effect of betrayal is memory and trauma. In Painting the City Red, Yummy Braister says, "Farewell is perhaps first and foremost an exploration of the relationship between personal and national memory. Throughout the film, memories are articulated through intimate objects, bodily scars, and urban spaces. Some examples Yomi provides is the scar of Daozi's chopped finger, Chateau constantly trying to perform acts of heroism by breaking bricks with his head, the candy crab apples being a reminder for Diei of a childhood friend's suicide, and Xiaolo in the last scene telling Diei that he said the line wrong, opening an unhealed wound, ending with Diei committing suicide and Chateau calling Diei by his childhood name. An object that carries many memories as well is the sword with which Diei ends up dying. I also viewed Yuxian as a personification of Diei's painful trauma towards his mother. Both women have some similarities, starting from the most obvious one of both being prostitutes. They are both also quite stubborn and work towards what they want regardless of whether it means using sneaky tactics or hurting others. And we can see glimpses of Diei's maternal trauma and moments where Yuxian, weirdly enough, shows some signs of maternal care or concern towards Diei, like when Diei is going through withdrawal from opium use.
水都冻冰了。
娘，手冷，水都冻冰了。
Or when she puts Diei's cape on him after Xiaolo and Xiaosi replace him in the opera troupe. Yet, the film also serves the director as a way to recreate memories at a more personal level. I mentioned before that Shen Kaige, being a teenager during the Cultural Revolution, had fallen into the trap of becoming a Red Guard and accusing his father of following the Four Olds due to his father being an educated film director. Even though Shen Sr. had survived the consequences and forgiven his son, Kaige still carried a lot of the guilt and portrayed that trauma through Xiaosi's betrayal of his adopted parents, one could say.
Was it painful for you to do that?
Very painful. Let me tell you the truth. I mean, I was a teenager. I was 14 years old. You know, what happened in my life is that, I mean, I did something just like this. You know, I denounced my father. I was asked to do this to my father.
To say your father was a spy.
Right.
Your father.
But I knew that he wasn't. I mean, he wasn't a spy.
You knew that you were succumbing to the pressure, as this man did about his wife.
Right. Exactly. But I did. Because I want to join the Red Guard. I want to show my loyalty to Mao. So that's why I was very ashamed, you know. So that's why I think the film is very important, not because it's important to audience, it's very important for myself. Because, you know, I mean, I want to make sure that I want to clean up, you know, the messes, I mean, what happened in the past.
Braister also points out that Kaige utilized the film as a love letter to an old Beijing that no longer existed, specifically in an architectural manner where most of the film is developed within a Siheyuan, a courtyard residence typical in Beijing before the Cultural Revolution. Shen Kaige recalls, "When shooting Farewell, I felt an unknown force taking hold of me. I believe that I put into the film all my understanding of Beijing and all that Beijing left in me. The Beijing that Kaige had grown up in no longer existed, so it was his opportunity to create on film the memories of the place he loves. All of the film's themes have so many layers to them, and the impressive thing is how naturally they seem to be interwoven with each other. Identity, performance, betrayal, memories, and trauma, all these elements becoming clear through the art of repetition in different scenarios. This repetition feels like actions that are mirrored by the characters between each other, and although nobody seems to realize it, it is these themes that tie them all together. The film was very much loved by the international public when it was first released. However, it didn't take long for some critics to point out some issues with the film and its portrayal of gay and queer people.